Today, Cahn and myself are going to be talking to you guys about old four-wheel drives. Now, we don't often talk about these things, but Cahn and myself are absolutely obsessed with old four-wheel drives. So we're going to be sharing some funny stories about going about purchasing an old four-wheel drive, some do's and don'ts and what you need to look out for.
That's right, guys. So Mitch and I both absolutely love older four-wheel drives. And that's not because we can't afford a new one. Or is it? But it's way better to get, a dozen old four-wheel drives rather than one new one, right? Which is pretty much what we've done over the years. Yeah. So we're going to tell you guys some funny stories, as Mitch said, and also plenty of advice on what to look for if you're thinking about buying an older four-wheel drive.
And of course, we've got behind us my very own daily drive, which is a 1988 Mitsubishi Pajero. We both absolutely love this thing, and it's in really good condition. I'm pretty sure Kahn's a bit jealous that he didn't buy it.
I think I actually told you about this car.
He did.
And I should have bought it,
yeah.
But that's another story.
But anyway, I beat him to the mark is the point. So we're going to be using this little beast as a bit of an example and a base of what to look out for.
Yeah, so the first thing we're going to talk about is what to look for in the body and mechanical. Which one's more important in terms of the condition of the vehicle?
Okay, so in your opinion, would it be better to buy a clapped out car with, say for example, a blown engine or a blown diff or something like that, with a really good body, or would it be better to get something that's in really good mechanical nick, but the body's falling apart? What do you reckon would be better?
Of course, it depends on your skill level.
Right.
I'm not a particularly good welder, but I can rebuild gearboxes and that sort of thing. So if I was looking for a vehicle, ideally you want one that's good in both scenarios. You want a good body, good driveline. But for me, I would personally choose to get a car that's a little unreliable mechanically, as long as it has a good body, particularly when you're talking about something this age, because rust and paint is a lot more expensive than you think. If you wanted to get,
to work on too.
It's a lot harder to work on if you don't have those skills. It's a lot harder to make it look good as well. So you could get a mate, to respray this for a couple of $1,000s sort of thing, but if you actually wanted a decent job and you went to a professional, it's probably going to cost you like $10,000 or $15,000, which is a lot of money when you haven't spent that much on the car in the first place.
And you went through this recently with a little Datsun Ute that you bought recently, didn't you?
Yeah, so my daily driver, not a full drive, an old Datsun Ute. I picked this thing up knowing that it had a lot of rust, and it was a bit of a challenge for me to learn how to TIG weld, and I had to TIG weld a lot more than even I expected. It's all fine now, but that thing needed a little bit of mechanical work, but a lot of rust repair. So it was off the road for a lot longer than had I just had to replace a gearbox, which might have been a weekend job rather than weeks and weeks and weeks.
Yeah, it was off the road for quite a while.
Quite a while.
So in your opinion, a blown engine, it's much easier to get out. Of course there's a cost involved, but it's a lot easier than say replacing the entire roof on a 60 series or something like that. As a lot of people have to do these days.
All that rust.
Right.
And these older vehicles, I guess, don't have as many sensors, not as much 12 volt, not as much electronics, no airbags. So replacing an engine is a hard job, but I don't think it's as hard as having to fix an entire rusty body.
Right. Rightio, so the next thing we're going to talk about is service history and receipts. Now, it's a lot of old four-wheel drives that just don't come with a service history, and that's somewhat normal, but you can pretty much gauge whether the car's been looked after or not by if the owner has had the car for a certain amount of time, maybe a few years, and if they've kept receipts for work that they've had done on it. Now, a lot of the times, young people will be convinced by the seller that the car has had, for example, an engine rebuild, but the owner doesn't happen to have any receipts. Now, this is my personal opinion. I don't know if you agree with this, but if the car doesn't have receipts, it didn't happen. It's as simple as that. If someone's going out of their way to spend, say, 5-6 grand or more on an engine rebuild, I find it hard to believe that they wouldn't want to keep receipts for something like that, especially because a rebuilt engine can add resale value to a vehicle.
Definitely, and the other thing is people might say something like, oh, it's got a rebuilt engine, but really, they've just had a head gasket done on it, or they've done something, they've tinkered around in there, and then all of a sudden it's been rebuilt. So just be clear on that.
Yeah, and I got super lucky with the Pajero here because it's had a rebuilt injector pump, and I've got receipts. I've got a folder full of receipts this thick, and the bloke that I bought it off, he'd had it since about 2006, and I bought it about 2.5 years ago, something like that. And he was a really good bloke, and you could just tell that he really loved this car. He did not want to get rid of it. Now, the reason he was actually selling it to me, he was super reluctant, as I said, was He was just doing a lot of long distance Ks, and not that this wasn't reliable enough for him, he just wanted something a little bit more comfortable and a bit more quiet on the highway. But he was a top bloke, and I'm so glad I got this one I did, because the price of these has gone through the roof.
And I know it's not related to the engine specifically, but another good indicator of how a car's been looked after, in my opinion, is take a really good look at the interior. Older vehicles like this, you might get a little rip in the seat or something, and that's nothing to stress about. But if there's big holes cut out of the dash and they've obviously not cared about it while they've owned it, it's a pretty good indicator that they might not have cared about keeping up with servicing and that sort of thing. And another hot tip that I often use is just ask the seller to check a couple of things like the oil and see if they know where the dipstick is.
Yeah, that's a good point actually. Now, another handy mechanical tip that you need to follow when you're looking at an old vehicle, doesn't really matter if it's petrol or diesel, but diesel in particular, is while the car's running, undo the oil filler cap here, and if it blows the oil filler cap off and like hits into the bonnet or something like that, it's got what's called blow-by, and it's a big problem. You're basically up for a full engine overhaul. So now if you open it up and it's just floating, it's got a little bit of blow-by, that's completely normal, don't stress about that. But if it's got anything excessive, then you want to steer clear of that vehicle.
Another thing to consider when you're looking at an older vehicle is the rarity of the vehicle. So you have to do a bit of research on that. If it's a model you've never heard of before, it might be difficult to find parts. I've had that issue a little bit. I've owned a number of mid-wheelbase Land Cruisers from the mid-1980s. And while they look very visually similar to like 75 series Land Cruisers and 79 series Land Cruisers, they have a lot of unique parts, which makes it a little bit more difficult if you do need to track something down. These days with the internet, it's a little bit easier, but it still takes a lot longer in a lot of cases to find those parts, which means your car is off the road for a longer period. And I know Mitch has had a couple of issues with this as well, with this thing.
This model in particular was very hard to find parts for. Because it's a 1988 model that didn't come out in Australia, it's imported from Japan in about 2004, so finding parts is very difficult. Now, this has actually sat at the mechanic shop for about 5 weeks. I threw it to my mechanic. I didn't have time to do the brakes myself, so I just threw it to him. So in the end, he didn't even end up finding parts for it, particularly the brake pads, because he ended up having to get them remade from the original ones, which is something I'd never even heard of before. But that's a very good point, is to find parts for the vehicle, or at least find a good stockist that you know of that can find parts for you, or join a Facebook group of the particular car that you're looking for, because they can be a real wealth of knowledge when it comes to that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I suppose when you're doing your research too, look for the things that are likely to go wrong, so you can at least check them out before you purchase an older four-wheel drive. You know, those little things that might seem like nothing when you're actually talking to the seller, oh, it just needs this or it just needs that. The reason they might be selling it is because that part is impossible to find, it's no longer in production. So, something to think about.
Yeah, which brings us to our next point, which is hidden traps when you're looking at an old four-wheel drive. Now, a very common one is, and actually a tip to go with this, is try not to look at the car at night time. Try to go at daylight where it's a bit of sun on the car so you can see what the body looks like and the chassis. Now I say the chassis because I know Cahn and myself have both come across a couple of cars that have had, what would you call it, a rattle can chassis rebuild? Yeah. So look for fresh paint on stuff, just go over it with a fine-tooth comb with absolutely every aspect, especially the chassis, because if there's rust in the chassis, that is the car's written off essentially. You cannot use a car with rust in the chassis. So,
and if it's been completely sprayed satin black, you won't be able to see any oil leaks or any obvious signs of issues.
Exactly.
But you'd really want to be able to see that, because it might only be a small thing. It might be, for me personally, one of my projects had a leaking sump gasket. It was a pretty easy fix, you know, but had it all been covered up and I'd driven it around without realizing, could have been a much bigger problem.
Exactly, and that's another thing. When you're looking underneath the car, if there's one particular part of the car underneath it that's perfectly clean, not a drop on it, but the rest of the car is pretty dirty, that could mean that they've just wiped off some oil to make it look like it doesn't leak anything. But if you drive the car around the block a couple times, look back underneath the car to see if anything else has come up, but do question the owner of the vehicle whether or not they've just wiped that, because it is a bit of a dodgy way that they get away with it.
And one more hidden trap that I'll bring up is related to what we were just talking about with parts. A big one is someone telling you that the AC or the air conditioning works, but it just needs a regas. Might be the case, but also on a lot of older vehicles, they might use an older gas or refrigerant, which you're not allowed to use anymore. Now, when you go to get it regassed, they need to put a whole new gas type in, which means all the seals and potentially some of the parts need to be replaced. If you've ever pulled apart an air conditioning system, there's a lot of fiddly little bits and pieces that you'd need to replace. So it's not just a couple $100 regas, it could turn into a multiple $1,000 job.
Expensive.
Another one, if the air conditioning hasn't been running for a while and that compressor is seized, you're up for a new compressor and all the rest of the pieces as well. So that's a big one. If someone says, oh, it just needs a regas, definitely have a look at the condition of the compressor and try and figure out when was the last time it potentially did work. Because if it was more than about a year or two, it's likely going to have some big issues.
That's right. And another thing, guys, don't be scared to call a mechanic and pay them a little bit of money to come and look at the car with you if you don't have anyone mechanically minded to come with you. Because I think a lot of people make the mistake of like assuming they can just go look at a car and it's going to be all good, but then they drive off down the driveway and it blows up on them. So don't be, not necessarily, but don't be scared to hire a mechanic, a proper professional mechanic to come along and look at the car with you. It won't cost you too much. We just got the car looked at and it costs us about 150 bucks.
Now we promised you some funny stories about vehicles Mitch and I have purchased, so we're going to rapid fire through a couple of quick stories. One, I drove all the way from Wollongong to Coffs Harbour to check out a 78 series Troopy, which I was guaranteed had very little rust, and I thought was a bargain. I basically cannonballed 8 or 9 hours up there, looked at the car for about 25 seconds, and then drove home. It was horrible, it had so much rust, and I could have avoided all that time and effort just by asking a couple more questions and actually pushing the seller a little bit more, because he, you know, oh, I've had no rust, of course. I should have asked the question a little bit more seriously.
Here's one for you. You remember my old Patrol, the GU I had?
Yes, yep. Petty.
Yes, chewed through a lot of petrol. So for that reason, I put it up for sale or swaps. A bloke ended up hitting me up with a Hilux that in his photos, he had about 3 or 4 photos. And it looked pretty good, it looked pretty tidy. And so I drove all the way up to Newcastle from, I think I was in Mudgee at the time, drove to Newcastle. And I get there and the car was wrecked. The interior just had milkshake sloshed all over the vinyl floor, cigarette stains and cigarette burns all through the seats. And I looked at him and I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, and I asked him about the photos. I'm like, how could you put this car up with these photos? And he goes, oh, those are the photos from the previous owner. I'm like, oh, thanks, man. That's awesome.
Sweet.
So needless to say, I wasted an entire tank of fuel to get there and back. So two tanks of fuel for nothing.
I've got another one which I've talked about before. My second mid-wheelbase Land Cruiser, which was an absolute bargain, one owner, in really good condition. I put a deposit down on it before Christmas, and then basically the seller out in Albury said that they leave it just out the back for me, and I didn't pick it up for about 4 or 5 weeks when it just sat and sat and sat. Now when I went and picked it up, it was all sweet. I was driving back up the Hume Highway back towards home. All of a sudden, no power, it just died, and I was stuck on the side of the road for hours with no reception. Basically ended up having to fix it by blowing all the fuel lines back out through the tank. It had been sitting for so long, all the fuel lines were full of sediment, and it blocked up the in-tank filter. No power, completely dead. So there I was, I'd just put money down on this car and I thought, what have I done? Missed 2 days of work because I couldn't get back, but there you go.
And of course, it doesn't all end badly. This thing here has been a real awesome car for me. It's a 1988 model. It's old as heck, but honestly hasn't had anything mechanically go wrong with it. The interior is in good nick, the body is awesome, and the paintwork is exceptional as well.
How many Ks are on this?
Just clicked over about 333,000, and that's the original engine, gearbox, everything. So.
Goes to show you don't need low Ks, late model, to have a reliable vehicle.
That's right. But don't just take our word for it, of course, guys. Both Cahn and I have cut our teeth in old four-wheel drives, and we absolutely love them, and that love will continue on. I don't think it'll ever fade.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to watch a similar video on a used late model four-wheel drive, Breno has done a video on exactly that, and it's a top watch, so go ahead and click on that link down below.
Now, if you guys want to see more of this Pajero, make sure you throw a comment down below, or tell us the funny stories you've had about buying older four-wheel drives. Finally, if you have any questions or any comments, make sure you throw them down below, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers.